Hello once again, J-Spot peeps, and thank you for spending some of your valuable time here with me in the J-Spot. I'm your host, Mr. J, and a shout out to all of you who have subscribed thus far. We really appreciate your support. And for those of you who have not, please do. Drop a comment, give us a thumbs up like, and make sure you hit that notification bell. Today we're going to continue our four-part series titled The Dark and Unexplored Corridors of Mental Health in the Black Community. Part 1, titled Open the Doors. We discussed beginning a discussion about mental health. Part 2, we talked about the House of Shame and the Hall of Myths, where we discussed the stigmas and the stigmatization of mental illness in the Black community. And part 3, which we continue today, is titled Turn on the Lights, in which we're going to discuss what we find once we open the door, once we enter the halls of shame, House of Shame and the Hall of Myths and turn on the lights, what we find and discover when we turn on those lights. You'd be surprised. As I discussed in part 2, the House of Shame and Hall of Myths, we talked about the fact that many in the African American community view those who suffer with mental illness / depression / bipolar disorder as weak and inferior. Stick a pin in that word, inferior. Moreover, African American women believed they were not susceptible to mental illnesses of any kind, particularly depression, and that those who do suffer from a mental illness within the Black community suffer only because they have poor health, they have a weak mind, they have a troubled spirit, and they lack self-love. Now, personally, the first three, poor health, weak mind, troubled spirit, I don't see where they apply at all. And the fourth one, lack of self-love, if anything, that's a symptom of mental health and depression in particular, not a causal effect. So, and if one were to enter the corridors where those who suffer dwell, you would find a variety of personalities, each one groping the cold walls as they attempt to navigate their way out of the agony in which they live. And if we were to turn on the lights of those corridors, what we are more likely to discover is that instead of seeking a way of escape, most victims of depression or mental illness will more than likely cower. As I said in the last video, they'll hide. Just like the person with the bad mouth will hide their smile, the people that dwell in those corridors, once discovered, they will run and hide. They won't wave their hand and say, "Here I is," because of the stigma that's attached, which is why they're in those halls hiding anyway, with the lights off. And I know this personally because my sister went through this. She suffered from bipolar disorder, also called manic depression illness. Now, as I said, we never noticed, my brothers and my sister, my other sister, we never noticed anything wrong with my sister. Even though most bipolar disorders manifest during the teen years, they can also emerge later in life as when you become an adult and become potentially a life-threatening illness that a person simply cannot handle alone. Now, what can be more alone than having to hide because you have an illness? What could be more overwhelming than trying to hide your smile? What could be more overwhelming to your mental state than having to hide or do something that is outside the normalcy of existence? Think about it from this perspective. Imagine if you had been born during slavery and you had to be subservient to every absurd whim of a master or his wife, knowing that if you did not comply with whatever directive one of the two of them were to give you, that you potentially could be beaten to within an inch of your life, and sometimes murdered. Imagine a man, a slave, a black man who's a slave, having to be that way in front of his wife and his child, knowing that if he did not comply, he would be beaten to within an inch of his life and maybe even drawn and quartered by horses and fed to the hogs. And the wife, who has a child standing there or is pregnant with a child, having to raise that child to be that way for that man or that woman. Having to hide when you tried to sneak a biscuit. Having to hide when you tried to learn to read. You don't think that would contribute to mental illness? Depression? And what's different about today than then, other than the fact that you don't have a chain? Because you can go outside, and if you make eye contact with a police officer, you might well be killed too. So you have to tell your child every day, if you tell him at all, make sure you say yes ma'am and yes sir to police officers. Every time a police officer gets behind you on the highway or the road, you tense up. You don't think that contributes to mental illness? That has nothing to do with having a weak mind, a troubled spirit, or poor health. And tragically, 1 in 5 people who suffer with bipolar disorder, they commit suicide. Now, to digress back to what I was saying about the police officers and the slaves, what could make you feel more inferior than having to acquiesce to the demands of someone simply because you know you might be beaten to within an inch of your life? You might be murdered when someone asks you for your driver's license and you reach for your driver's license in your glove compartment and you're murdered in your car. Why would you think someone in your community is inferior because that type of overwhelming existence contributes to a state of poor mental health? And when you turn on the lights and they run, they cower. And turning on the lights doesn't mean literally turning on the light. It just means that you discover someone in your community is suffering. And because they're suffering, you think it's a joke and you make fun of it. And you don't reach out your hand to help. One of the signs of bipolar disorder is excessive energy, restlessness, racing thoughts, and rapid talking. If you encounter someone like that, what would be your first thought? Oh, they're high on drugs. Something's wrong with them. It's not, you don't go to mental illness, you go to the default way of thinking that they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing, which is why they're like that. Speaking of drugs and being high, believe it or not, mental illness and substance use disorder go hand in hand. Because for one thing, because we don't get the proper treatment and we don't access care that we need because we're hiding in those corridors, we self-medicate. And you tend to self-medicate on medications and drugs that aren't for you. So my petition to you is stop thinking just one way. You know, it's kind of like homelessness. You know, you don't think, when you see an unhoused person, as they're called, referred to as today, these days, what's your default thinking when you see that person? It's not always, or a majority of the time, you don't think that something actually may have happened to that person. You think that something that they probably just did something wrong and they're out there. In today's world, folks, we have to be mindful of the needs of others. Because with what's going on in the world today in our government, there's no one looking out for us anymore. And the last thing we need is to turn on the lights and start down this road and enter these corridors and think that everybody in the corridor is there because they did something to themselves, because they lack self-love, because they have poor health, which is what mental illness is. Or they have a troubled spirit, and that they're weak and inferior. Turn on the lights. Open the door. Go down those halls of myths and turn on the lights. And you'd be surprised. You just might find yourself in there. That you've been living there all the time and did not even know it. Because it could be you. It could be you. It could be you. Thank you once again, J-Spot peeps, for spending some of your valuable time here with me in the J-Spot. Make sure, if you haven't already, give us a thumbs up, like, subscribe, and hit that notification button. We'd like to have our subscriptions up to 500 by the end of the month. And drop a comment. Talk about what you've heard here. Share something with me that we can start a discussion with. We've opened the door. We're in the hallway. We're turning on the lights. Let's talk about what we find. Peace. This could be you. I stand on corners every day. I sleep on them at night. You see me when you pass my way. To you, I am a blight. I eat pig feet from a jar, while you have cream and lox. Your side dish is caviar, mine crackers from a box. The clothes I wear are hand-me-downs, yours are custom-made. Your tailor's name is world-renowned, mine is named Let's Trade. You think that my lack of success is a sign of stupidity. Well, I think your wretched excess is a sign of cupidity. Your routine's constant every day. Mine changes with the weather. I'm not on your mind when you pray. You only pray your life gets better. So stop thinking just one way and start thinking how and why. And thank the Lord that you can say, there but by His grace go I.